All right, we're going to kick off the next session, starting in a minute. Take your seat. AV, are you guys ready to switch for the stream? You're good? Okay, good. I cannot see the sign. All right, so Chad is gonna talk about Web3 before it was cool. And then, sorry, I wasn't checking the app for question earlier, but this time I will because I'm not moderating. So you have question for Chad throughout the presentation. Use the app to submit your questions. And I'm gonna just say hi to those that are online streaming and watching remotely. Thank you for joining us as well. So Chad, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So most of my career, I've been working in decentralized authentication. I didn't find out until very recently in my career that the cool kids call it Web3. So this is going to be a story and a journey about where we started and where we're going. So a little bit about me, just to set the precedent for this talk. I started my career as a hacker. I did a lot of very cool things that I'm not comfortable talking about on a recorded talk, but we can talk offline. I was a CTF player for a long time, played in like the Olympics of hacking. I've been an academic almost my entire career. I got a master's degree in authentication and access control, a doctorate, and then I was a researcher at Lincoln Laboratory, and I was at IBM Research for a bit, and now I am an entrepreneur selling, making decentralized authentication products. So the agenda for today, we're going to do a little bit of internet history lesson. My 13-year-old told me that the past should stay in the past. He really hates that subject, but I think there's some cool stuff back there. Look at where we are now. There's a couple gotchas that I think are worth noting. And then the future, which I think is extremely exciting, especially with most of the folks at this conference and in this industry in general, where we're going. So first, I want to emphasize the difference between a centralized system and a decentralized system. So on your left, you have the snow leopard here. This is a lone hunter. They go out for the kill, and if we are, the prey and we kill the snow leopard, that's it, game over. Versus a decentralized system, which would be a swarm of bees that are all completely autonomous but with a shared mission, right? So if you're trying to kill a swarm of bees, it's miserable. You get stung a lot. Even if you win, you feel like you lost. So also worth noting that a distributed system is not a decentralized system. So there are very subtle differences. So a distributed system is a system that has a single task spread across many computers, but it typically has a centralized control point. So you can think of this as like your cloud instances that are going to keep auto-scaling. There's some centralized server that's doing all of the auto-scaling, and all of these systems are kind of running under that centralized server. But a decentralized system are completely independent computers working on a common task with no centralized control. And as far as this graph goes, I actually have no clue what this means. It's just if you Google it, it was like the first satellite publication. I like that it's controversial. So let's go talk about the internet of old. Back in my day, this is what the original internet looked like, at least from my point of view as a hacker on the internet. You really had your message boards, your Usenet. You had a couple, email protocols. You had a couple web clients. FTP was really popular. Gopher, IRC chat was really, the way that everybody was communicating. And then you had a couple web crawlers and things. A lot of these were actually decentralized systems. So like, for example, IRC servers, anybody could go start their own IRC server and boot that up. The timeline, if we look at this from authentication standpoint, the internet was created, early 80s. We had the X509 cert, followed soon thereafter for a way to do asymmetric encryption on the internet. PGP came out in the early 90s. Then we had a pretty big gap. TLS and SAML were then soon to follow, so this let us do e-commerce and single sign-on. Then again, about a decade gap before we got to OIDC and FIDO. Started to come on the scene here, at least the specifications for FIDO, not a lot of products. FIDO 2 was 2015 when that spec was actually published. 2019, we then saw verifiable credentials in WebAuthn. We all know where we are today, and what I'm imploring everybody here to do is to saddle up, get ready for some hard work so that we can get for the better tomorrow where we have decentralized and self-sovereign identity. So I really want to emphasize PGP, pretty good privacy, and really some pretty good ideas there. So the way this worked, they would take a private key and they would bind it to your email. And then you could use that private key as your identity to sign your email or encrypt anything that you wanted. But it was primarily focused around email, but there's no reason it couldn't have been used, more globally. Just at the time, the internet was pretty email focused. There was one small major problem, and this paper was published in 1996, and ever since then, the cybersecurity industry has never been able to solve it. And it is why Johnny can't encrypt, a usability evaluation of PGP5. So while all of the cryptography was sound, all of the ideas were sound, it was completely unusable and an absolute nightmare. So therefore, to this day, how many people in this room have sent an email using PGP? Okay, that's not a lot, but that's, and given this crowd, you would think it would even be higher. So the one really interesting concept that PGP brought forth was called the web of trust. So the way this worked is that my private key would be signed by other people in the web. So therefore, if you never met me, as long as you trust somebody in that web that trusts me, you could actually have transitive trust and therefore trust me. So you can see in this web that you have indirect trust and direct trust relationships. But the cool thing was, as this built up, if somebody would become untrusted or you would bring somebody else into the web, it was very resilient, these trust relationships. Moving forward to the internet of today. So this is what a typical authentication flow looks like today if you're not using passkeys. You're going to type in your username and password. First, you're going to type in your username into this computer. It's going to go to the website. The website is going to send you a redirect. Hey, this is using a SAML login. You're going to go to an SSO provider. Then you go to the third party where you type in your username and password. That will then generate an OTP code and send it to your phone, maybe over SMS, or maybe there's already an authenticator on your phone. That then OTP code goes into your brain, out of your brain, back into the keyboard. Then you send it to the third party. That third party verifies it. They give you a token. You send the token back to the original website, and you're logged in. So this is incredibly simple, straightforward, and there are almost no vulnerabilities in this approach, other than these few. But it's probably worth noting a couple of them. So one of them is that it's actually not resilient to observation. So if you watch me do this, if you're shoulder surfing me, you would then know my username, my password, and my OTP code. More sophisticated, if you had a keylogger or malware on my computer, you could man in the middle of that whole process, and at whatever moment you think it's appropriate, you cut me out of the loop, and you take my session and run with it. Obviously, malware on the computer can do all sorts of fun stuff. There's session hijacking attacks, so maybe I just log in successfully, you just come take my session and use my session and become me. There's obviously phishing attacks, even in this scenario, because I'm typing the OTP code into the same web browser every time. So if I fished your username and password, I can also phish your OTP code. You can actually go git clone Evil Nginx 2 and set it up on DigitalOcean in about, 5-10 minutes. There's really nice how-to guides on how to do this phishing attack at scale. And then you have the compromise of the third-party identity provider as well, right? So even if your website is secure, if your IDP gets compromised, you're at risk. So out of all these attacks, I think the two that are really important to focus on are the credential theft and the session hijacking. So FIDO really focuses heavily on this credential theft, right? So the technique for that is typically phishing. So if you're using a phishing-resistant credential, you're in way better shape, and you're going to make the phishing attack much harder. The other one is session hijacking, where you're doing man-in-the-middle attacks or some malware where you're actually going to hijack the session after you're logged in. So, for example, my personal Gmail, I can't remember the last time that session expired. I don't know how long they last, but it's pretty long. So if somebody were able to hijack that session, they would be able to use it for a pretty long period of time. So a quick sidebar that has always kind of confused me on the internet is now DNS has become one of the linchpins of security and authentication, right? And it was not intentional, I don't believe, but we've gotten to a point where the system that resolves numbers into names to make them more human memorable has now become the identity of most online services instead of their cryptographic identity. I know what you're thinking. We have CAs. Obviously, Chad, this is wrong. Maybe someday we'll actually get DNSSEC. I'm not holding my breath. I remember when I started grad school in 2008, I started my first PhD, I said, yes, DNSSEC's right around the corner. So who knows? The interesting thing here is if you look at who you trust, so depending on what browser you're on, what operating system you're on, you're trusting a lot of different entities, these certificate authorities. Why do we trust them? Because there was some negotiation previously where somebody trusted them enough to put them in our browser. And I think this meme here summarized it pretty well. When you trust a person, you either have a friend or you have a life lesson. So how bad could it be if one of these CAs went sour? So there's a couple hard questions we have to ask ourselves here. How many CAs are currently compromised? How would we even know if they were, right? If it's a good attack, they're not going to tell us. The attacker's not going to say, hey, I have VeriSign's private key, and I can sign whatever I want with it. And then what could we do even if they were? If every CA got compromised today, what is plan B? So, Carl Sagan said the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So just because we don't know they're not compromised doesn't mean that we might not be vulnerable to these. And in fact, there's precedent for this. It has actually happened. So Kim Kardashian tried very hard to break the internet. She failed miserably. But these hackers actually did it. They completely compromised DigiNotar. This was back in, I think I have it up there, 2011. And they actually used these attacks in practice. So they were man-in-the-middling people doing some DNS hijacking attacks and successfully compromising folks. So the step is pretty clear. You get a CA's root signing cert, you hijack DNS, you do whatever the heck you want. So we're also in a world now where we have identity as a centralized service. So in general, this is bad for privacy. Every time you log in, that third-party IDP knows where you're logging into. It's good for security and bad for security. I'm arguing it's bad for security in the sense that there's now a single point of failure, which in all of my research I try to mitigate. But it's extremely convenient for users, right? We went from trying to remember 250 passwords to just being able to click, log in with whatever IDP you chose. So I posit that we are one really good hack away from catastrophe, and I think the Okta hack, it didn't go this far, but it kind of brought awareness to this could happen, right? I didn't want to use the typical meme online, so I found the Guinness World Record for the most stacked Jenga pieces. But what we really have here is every enterprise customer on top of these large IDPs, and if you knock over that one Jenga piece, the whole thing is going to topple. And this kid was able to stack 1,843 blocks, which is still mind-bending. So the future, where I think we are going, and I hope we're going, and it seems like all of the momentum and everything that I see every time I come to this conference really seems like we are going to get there. So the general goals for the future, we need to use secure private keys instead of passwords. I think that is across the board pretty widely accepted at this point. We need to have some hardware in the loop on these private keys. Obviously, they're pretty hard to remember. If you're going to replace the private key, it's going to be nice to have a computer remember it for you. I think binding them to the hardware to mitigate software attacks is critically important. So in my PhD, I was looking at a lot of low-level embedded systems work. You can actually use things like physically unclonable functions if you want to go that far, depending on your security level, or just having some TPM or some secure element in the hardware is pretty sufficient. Decentralizing trust to mitigate any of these doomsday scenarios where you have one single point of failure, that if everybody in the world trusts that one piece and that piece gets compromised, we all get toppled. I think eliminating credential theft, we all agree on that. And really eliminating session hijacking. So if you look at the attacks that are coming up, it's like once we've mitigated phishing, the next thing that's getting hit is session hijacking attacks. So just getting ourselves out in front of that. But if we can meet these 4 goals, we're going to have a really good time. So why I think sessions need to cease. So I don't think they answer the question that you want to ask as the service provider. So we care if the user and their credential is present, not necessarily if a cookie is present. So I think this XKCD, they say, if someone steals my laptop while I'm logged in, they can read my email, take my money, and impersonate me to my friends, but at least they can't install drivers without my permission. And this is really where we are with the sessions, right? So even if I have malware on my computer, okay, my drivers are protected and they can't change my wallpaper and things, but all of these sessions are so critically valuable. So getting to a point where somehow we're binding these sessions to a hardware token that we have on our person, so if we walk away, so does the session, or some other way to come up with a solution for this. And I really think we finally got the missing piece of the puzzle on why Johnny couldn't encrypt back in those days. So we didn't have computers in our pockets, they weren't small enough, but now we can. It's very easy to carry our private keys around our pocket and even go to a key sharing party. We could all tap phones while we're here at Allthenticate, and then our web of trust could build. We could actually try this again at scale with technology that makes usability usable. So the future of authentication, in my mind, where I think we are going, will have hardware in the loop, multi-factors, and mathematically sound keys. It will be phishing resistant, much harder to steal at scale. So if you have hardware in the loop, you can no longer do these just swath software attacks where I'm going to compromise 2 million users with one CVE, but I now need to get on a plane and go fly to all of those users' homes and steal all of their hardware tokens. We can do point-to-point authentication where you don't have to go out to a third party. So when you log in with a passkey, for example, you're just talking directly to the relying party, right? So this is decentralized authentication. Every relying party stores their own public keys. You store all of your own private keys for those RPs, and you can log in a decentralized fashion. And unique credentials per service. This is really needed for privacy-preserving purposes, so you can't be tracked amongst all of your interactions, and it will minimize the blast zone if one of those gets compromised. I worked for the DoD for a long time, so I used military jargon. So things to watch going forward, and I think how these get used, how these get deployed is going to be really interesting over the next decade. So we have the FIDO 2 standard, where you can have smartphone-based private keys that are used for web login. You can also bind those private keys to other hardware devices. There's no reliance on a third-party verifier, which is really nice. And they can be bound to hardware for increased security. There's also verifiable credentials that are in this realm that, they're an extremely metadata-rich format for storing your private keys. You can even do privacy-preserving proofs, where I could prove that I am, a US citizen without telling you what state I'm from, or that I live in Texas without telling you my address, or that I'm above 21 without telling you how old I am. So that stuff is all baked into the protocols and really interesting. And then there's DIDs that kind of tie the verifiable credential, decentralized identity thing together. It's just a globally unique identifier that's tamper-resistant and censorship-resistant. So these could be stored in some public distributed registry that everybody trusts. Again, going back to the past, PGP did this with everybody's public key and emails on a public list. So we really are coming full circle, but doing it better the second time around. One of my PhD committee members told me that anything worth doing is worth redoing. So I think this is society's attempt at redoing something that was a good idea with a poor execution and redoing it again and again and again. And honestly, this isn't going to be the last time we redo this. So the authentication of tomorrow is a much, much more simple flow. Your brain is barely used in this flow, which is amazing. So you go out to a website, that website can then challenge you through your computer to your phone. It sends a response back. The only attacks you have here are to compromise the service that you're interacting with. There's no third-party service that can get compromised, or a physical attack on the device storing your keys. So this is what a lot of my PhD work was spent on. How do we get it to the point where we really do have to make them come and steal our phones or steal our laptops? Because once we get to that point, the attacks are a whole different game and a way, way better world than we live in today. There are a few open problems. So before everybody leaves this talk and yay, yippee, this world's great, we do need to kind of move slowly into the fully decentralized world. So key recovery is going to be an issue for a while. There are some really cool schemes coming out of academia. I think I've seen Bitcoin pick a couple of them up. They seem to care the most about how to recover their private keys in a decentralized, privacy-preserving, no government-in-the-loop fashion. And then secure interactions on smartphones. This one is actually interesting. So you can actually use the trusted execution environment in your phones today that when you get a cryptographic challenge, you can actually turn off all peripherals. You can turn off the accelerometer, all the side channels, completely take over the screen from the secure world, and guarantee that the message that was sent in that cryptographic challenge is the message displayed to the user. You know, do you want to wire $10,000 to this bank account number? You can assert yes, knowing with confidence that that was not tampered and that your interaction with it could not have been man-in-the-middled or masqueraded. It is actually quite hard to do that, and as far as I'm aware, nobody has done it yet to date on a modern phone. The reason being, you have to port all of the video driver code into a secure world. It's kind of a mess. There's been attempts on it. NVIDIA tried. I know that Google had Trusty. Eventually, somebody has to figure this out if we're really going to start putting that much trust in these devices and, you know, doing decentralized banking and voting and things like that. But it's 100% possible. I spent most of my life vetting all of these hard technical problems and ticking the boxes, convincing myself that we can do it. We definitely can do it. It's just we got to pull up our sleeves and get it done. So in summary, centralized authentication, I think, you know, really does put society at risk. It's the best we have right now. But going forward, you know, as we keep scaling this and putting more and more trust in these private keys, it's going to be critically important to decentralize this a little bit so we don't have a doomsday. Technology exists today to mitigate all of these risks. That's a fantastic news. We don't have to go, you know, roll new processors and push out new hardware architectures. The future is going to be absolutely awesome, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So we're chipping away at it slowly. You know, hopefully we all really hustle. We get this out in 5 to 10 years, but that would be pretty optimistic. I'm willing to put in the work though. So this is the future I want to see happen, where we take everything we've ever had in our pockets and purses, we put them securely in our phone, and then we start producing pants that only have one pocket. I think when we get to that point, we know that we've done it, because we don't need credit cards, we don't need our IDs anymore, we can have it all securely in our phone. So any fashion designers in the crowd, you might want to go ahead and start designing these, because it's going to be a pretty hot market. So at that point, I will take any questions, and thank you so much for attending.
Any questions? I'm not seeing anything in the app either. Psst.
Is there a reason why your spec for single pocket pants has it on one side or the other?
Most of the population is right-handed, so I figure going with the right side would probably sell more pants.
That's not very inclusive design, but okay. Well, and why it has to be pants? I mean, dress, skirt should have pockets. Just saying. Well, thank you, Chad. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.